Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something pretty dark but super interesting from history. Victorian workhouses. These places were basically where the poorest of the poor ended up in 19th century Britain. And trust me, by the time we're done, you're going to be real grateful for that comfortable bed you're lying in right now. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, find that cozy spot. Take a nice slow breath and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to Victorian England. So congratulations, you just woke up in a Victorian workhouse in the 1840s. Your eyes crack open to darkness, proper darkness, not the gentle glow of streetlights seeping through blinds or the soft blue of your phone charging. Just black. Your back aches. The thin straw mattress beneath you might as well be the wooden slats it's barely covering. Around you, the sound of breathing, lots of breathing, coughing too, dozens of other men packed into this dormitory like sardines. The smell hits you next, unwashed bodies, the sharp tang of urine from the shared chamber pots, and something else, that institutional smell of lye, soap and dampness and despair. It's cold, February cold, the kind that settles into your bones. The single thin blanket they gave you might as well be tissue paper. You curl up tighter, trying to hold on to your own warmth, careful not to touch the stranger lying inches from you. The workhouse was a big deal in Victorian Britain. While the rich folks were showing off their fancy clothes and building factories, these grim buildings housed the people who fell through the cracks. They caused misery to millions and made even more people feel ashamed. You shift slightly, finding a slightly less uncomfortable position as you try to make sense of where you are and how the system works. For the poor, the homeless, the unemployed or the sick in Victorian Britain, there were no welfare benefits and no national health service. They could starve on the streets or turn to the workhouse as a last resort. By the time these places finally shut down in 1948, they had housed over 16 million people caught between poverty and destitution. 5 million people died inside their walls. Today, 1 in every 10 Britons has a family connection to these places. That's how widespread and significant they were to ordinary people's lives. But what exactly were these places, and why were they so feared? The ceiling above you is high and institutional. Somewhere outside this dormitory, a bell will soon ring to wake everyone for the day. You can almost feel it coming, like animals sense an earthquake. The workhouse system started in 1834 as what the government thought was a clever solution to the growing problem of poverty. The idea was brutally simple: humiliate the poor for asking for help, shame them into standing on their own 2 feet. In the quiet darkness, you hear someone a few beds down muttering in their sleep, something about his children. You learn later that he hasn't seen them since they all entered this place together 3 weeks ago. They were immediately separated, him to the men's ward, his wife to the women's, and his children to the children's quarters. Families torn apart was just standard procedure. Splitting people up was at the heart of the workhouse system. Children from their parents, wives from their husbands. By keeping different groups of paupers apart, the authorities thought they could stop what they saw as the toxic influence of poverty and prevent the spread of what they called bad behaviour. You're starting to understand now. This isn't just a poorhouse, it's a prison for the crime of being poor. The first hints of dawn are showing through the high, small windows. The dormitory is becoming visible in shades of grey, iron bedsteads lined up with military precision, men of all ages curled under identical thin blankets, some old, some merely children above 14 who qualified for the men's ward. Some are clearly sick, their breathing laboured. The buildings themselves were designed to judge people, to make them feel bad about themselves for being there, to scare everyone else from wanting to go there. These places were meant to be terrifying, so you would do anything you could to avoid them. The whole system was intentionally harsh. When Oliver Twist famously asked for another bowl of gruel, he was hit about the head with a ladle. Charles Dickens wasn't making up the brutality of workhouse life. The system was deliberately designed to make sure that life on the inside was worse than earning a pittance on the outside. You notice something about the men around you as they begin to stir. Their heads are all cropped short, almost shaved. You reach up and realise yours is too. Another way to strip away who you are. A heavy-set man appears at the doorway, the master, his face set in that particular expression of disinterested cruelty. Without a word, he rings a large handbell. The day has officially begun. Up, up, he barks. Line up for washing. Anyone not dressed and ready in 10 minutes gets no breakfast. The sudden commotion is startling. Dozens of men scrambling from their beds, reaching for the identical uniforms hanging on pegs. For the men, it's a striped shirt, ill-fitting trousers, a thick vest, woolen drawers and socks, a neckerchief and a coarse jacket. The rough fabric chafes against your skin, already red and irritated from yesterday. You join the shuffling line to the washroom. Cold water, shared towels, the indignity of it all designed to break your spirit, to remind you that you are no longer a person. You are a pauper, a burden on society. In Glasgow around this same time, a man named Patrick McCann was just the type of person the authorities wanted to target. He was a labourer who, like 1/3 of the city's population, managed to survive on the poverty line. But in 1897, Patrick ended up in the Scottish version of the workhouse, the poorhouse. Patrick was one of thousands of Irish immigrant workers who had flocked to Glasgow, hoping to find work after their own country was devastated by famine. He lived in the Cowcaddens area, one of the city's poorest districts, with his wife and their 8 children. They lived in tenements, with 40 to 50 other people sharing one building. Patrick's family had one room with a fireplace and one bed. That was it for the whole family. No heating, drafty, damp. By the late 19th century, Cowcaddens had one of the highest infant mortality rates in Europe. 1 in every 5 children died of poverty-related illnesses, including 5 of Patrick's own children. You shuffle into the dining hall with the other men. Breakfast is served in grim silence. A bowl of thin gruel, basically watery porridge made from oats and water, and a small piece of bread. You're given exactly 6 ounces, while the women will receive only 5. Everything is measured and controlled. The gruel tastes like sadness itself, but hunger makes you eat every drop. No one speaks. Talking during meals is strictly forbidden. The workhouse ran under rigid rules, with harsh punishments for even minor stuff. For something as simple as swearing, inmates could have their already meagre diet restricted for up to 48 hours. For more serious offences, they could be locked up in isolation for 24 hours, fed only bread and water. After breakfast, the real purpose of the workhouse begins. Work, hard, monotonous, soul-crushing work designed to occupy your time and remind you of your place. The men are directed to the stone yard. Here, you'll spend hours breaking large stones into smaller ones for road construction. The women are set to doing laundry, scrubbing floors, or picking oakum, pulling apart old ropes into fibres to be reused in shipbuilding, a task that leaves fingers bloody and raw. The work isn't just difficult, it's pointless, designed to grind you down. The yard is cold in winter, baking in summer. There's no break. You're expected to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, all to earn your place, your gruel, your thin blanket. By 1900, economic expansion had made Britain the richest nation on the planet, and yet almost 1/3 of the country's urban population lived in poverty. To control the number of poor becoming dependent on what would today be called welfare benefits, paupers had to pass what was known as the workhouse test. In order to qualify for help, they had to be prepared to endure this regimen, to surrender their freedom, their dignity, their families. The workhouse wasn't technically a prison. The door was always open, and people were free to leave if they wanted, but for many, there was nowhere else to go. For 1 in every 10 who came in, the only way out was in a coffin. This is what happened in presenter Fern Britton's family. Her great-great-great-grandfather Friend Carter died in the workhouse. He had a cool Christian name, Friend, and whatever he did well because his descendants turned out all right. Like a quarter of the population of Victorian Britain, Friend scraped a living working on the land. The upheaval of industrialisation and rural unemployment led to riots throughout his home county of Kent. But despite this mess, Friend was a hard worker and managed to stay out of the workhouse even when he was old. By 1871, at the age of 64, Friend was still working. Hard work that wouldn't have been easy for him. He was living with his daughter Harriet at this time. People relied on each other then, especially family. The family unit was very important because there was no backup, no pensions, no income. To the Victorians, the family unit was sacred. By threatening to break up families, the workhouse played on the worst fears of society. But even the strongest families were sometimes beaten by poverty. You pause in your stone breaking, straightening your aching back for a moment. The overseer isn't looking. You glance at the high walls surrounding the yard. Beyond them is freedom, but also starvation. At least here there's food, shelter, bare minimums that have become luxuries to the truly destitute. In 1879, the youngest of Friend's 10 children, Jessie, was taken ill with angina, a heart condition. The workhouse was one of the few places the poor could get free healthcare, and although conditions inside were dire, Friend had no choice but to take his son there as a last resort. Jessie stayed in the workhouse from January 1879 until April, 3 or 4 months. His medical condition was so serious he was transferred to a London hospital, but what Friend didn't know was that this would turn out to be a fate worse than death. The lunch bell rings. You set down your hammer with relief. Your hands are blistered, your back screaming in pain. You file back into the dining hall with the other men. Another silent meal. Today, it's a thin soup with a few vegetables floating in it. On Sundays, you might get a small piece of meat. Not today. The bread is dry, but you're grateful for every crumb. The earliest workhouses showed up in the 17th century, but it was the Victorians who first used them as the basis of a national welfare strategy. At its peak, there were 700 workhouses in England, housing over 250,000 people. Each was run by a master and matron, and the largest ones held over 1,000 inmates at a time. They were like small, miserable cities of the poor. Your legs ache as you stand in line, waiting. Your feet shift a bit, seeking a more comfortable position. A man nearby looks at you with empty eyes. How long has he been here? Weeks? Years? Time seems to lose all meaning within these walls. Charlie Chaplin came to Lambeth Workhouse as a child with his mother Hannah and his half-brother Sidney. When Charlie was 9 years old, his alcoholic father deserted the family. In July 1898, Charlie ended up at Lambeth Workhouse with his mother and half-brother. When they arrived, Hannah was separated from her two sons. She was taken to the female ward on one side of the building, while the two boys were taken to the children's building across the way. Immediate separation. That was how the system worked. A week after they first arrived, Charlie and Sydney met up with their mother. Charlie wrote about that reunion in his autobiography. How well I remember the poignant sadness of that first visiting day, the shock of seeing Mother enter the visiting room garbed in workhouse clothes, how forlorn and embarrassed she looked. In 1 week she had aged and grown thin, but her face lit up when she saw us. Sydney and Charlie began to weep, which made their mother weep. Eventually she pulled herself together and they sat together, her hands in her lap while she gently patted them. She smiled at their cropped heads and stroked them consolingly, telling them that they would soon be all together again. But the family's moment of reunion was all too brief. After 8 days, Charlie and Sydney were sent to a pauper school on the edge of London, leaving Hannah alone in the workhouse. A week or two later, Hannah ended up in the infirmary with what was described as dermatitis and bruises all over her body. She had somehow been victimized, picked on, hit. It wasn't clear whether it was by staff or by other people, but she had physically suffered some kind of abuse. In the workhouse infirmary, Hannah would have had her wounds cleaned and dressed. For her pain, she would have been given opium. She spent about 9 days in the infirmary, and then after a couple of months, she was transferred from the workhouse to Cane Hill Lunatic Asylum. Basically, 7 weeks after entering the workhouse, she ended up in the insane asylum, a place that was even worse than where she started. Officially, physical punishment wasn't allowed in workhouses, although unofficially abuse happened all the time. This is partly what made the workhouse such a feared institution, but the torment of life inside wasn't just physical, it was also psychological, as inmates were stripped of their dignity. You're finding it hard to keep your eyes open as dinner approaches. The constant work, the early rise, the poor sleep, it's all designed to wear you down. Your muscles ache from the unaccustomed labour. Your stomach growls despite the meagre meals. Around you, the other men move like ghosts. Some have been here for years. Some are just passing through during hard times. All are marked by the experience, hollow-eyed, beaten down, the system working exactly as intended. The bell rings for dinner. Your final meal of the day, back to the dining hall. Tonight it's a small piece of cheese and more bread. You eat slowly, savouring each bite, knowing there will be nothing more until morning. After dinner, there might be a brief period where you're allowed to sit. Some workhouses had small libraries of improving religious texts. No novels or anything that might encourage imagination or discontent. Then it's back to the dormitory as darkness falls. You lie on your thin mattress, your body sinking deeper into the bed, every muscle finally allowed to release after the day's labour. Around you, men are already asleep, exhausted beyond measure. Their breathing creates a rhythm, rising and falling in the darkness. Your eyelids are heavy, but your mind is still active. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after. The endless routine designed to punish you for the crime of being poor, to remind you that society sees your poverty as a moral failing rather than the result of circumstances often beyond your control. You shift slightly, finding a slightly more comfortable position as the sound of rain begins to patter against the high windows, and sleep finally begins to claim you in this strange, cruel place that millions called home. Your breathing naturally slows as you stare up at the ceiling, wondering what tomorrow will bring as the workhouse slowly settles into its nightly quiet, the only sound the occasional cough or snore from your fellow inmates sharing this hard fate with you. Dawn breaks earlier in the workhouse than anywhere else in England, it seems. The bell jangles you awake from what feels like minutes of sleep. Your body protests. Every muscle aches from yesterday's labor, but there's no time for self-pity. Not here. The master's already shouting. Another day in the Victorian workhouse begins. Let's talk about what actually happened to Jesse Carter after he was transferred to that London hospital. His father friend had no idea what fate awaited his son there. Jesse's condition was so bad that he died on May 1st. Given the amount of pain he was in, it was probably a relief that he'd gone. But what happened next was the truly horrific part. Back then, the hospital was keen to find out why a young man like Jesse would have died. This was a period when medical learning was advancing and medical students would pay extra money to dissect someone like Jesse. See, if a family had enough money, the body would go back to them and they would take care of it, but if not, then he'd go off for dissection, and in fact, many medical students in the hospital would have paid extra money to dissect someone like Jesse. The reality was brutal. For the crime of poverty, and it was regarded as a crime at the time, you would be dissected. It was your fault that you'd not climbed up out of this situation, and the way to repay your welfare debt to society was to go for dissection. The government would care for you in life, provided you repaid your welfare debt in death. Dissection back then didn't just mean slightly cutting the body. Photos from the time show how they would cut bodies apart extensively. The families of the poor were rightfully terrified of what would happen to their loved ones' bodies after death. Friend Carter must have been worried sick when he found out Jesse had been transferred to London. The workhouse was bad enough, but at least it was close to home. Now his son was miles away, and communication between institutions was almost non-existent. While Friend would eventually end up in the workhouse himself at the age of 91, his family somehow scraped together enough money to ensure he got a proper Christian burial when he died. They wouldn't let his body go to the anatomists, no matter how poor they were. The Victorian attitude toward the poor was shockingly cruel. They were seen as less than human, almost a different species. The workhouse wasn't designed to help people get back on their feet. It was designed to punish them for being poor. You line up for breakfast with the other men. The same gruel, the same small piece of bread. You watch a new arrival, still not broken by the system, grimace at the taste. You barely notice it anymore. Hunger is a better seasoning than salt could ever be. After breakfast, you're marched back to work. The day stretches ahead, endless and empty. Let's talk about what made the workhouse diet so terrible. Breakfast was typically gruel or porridge, both made from water and oatmeal. Workhouse broth was usually just the water used for boiling the dinner meat, maybe with a few onions or turnips thrown in. The midday dinner varied a bit, although several days a week it could just be bread and cheese. On better days there might be a small portion of boiled meat, potatoes, or a plain sweet pudding with no sauce or flavouring. The food was intentionally bland and minimal, just enough to keep you alive and working, never enough to satisfy, never enough to enjoy. For the old or infirm, tea might be provided, often without milk, along with a small amount of butter at breakfast. The rules for the parish workhouse of St. John at Hackney in the 1750s specified a daily allowance of 7 ounces of meat when dressed without bones to every grown person, 2 ounces of butter, 4 ounces of cheese, 1 pound of bread, and 3 pints of beer. Yeah, they actually gave out beer. Weak or small beer was widely consumed by both adults and children, both for its flavour and as an alternative to water, which was often contaminated. Many workhouses even made their own beer and had a brewhouse specifically for this purpose. Now let's get back to Charlie Chaplin. He and his brother Sidney were sent to a school for poor children miles away from the life they'd known. Charlie was one of over 800 pupils at Hanwell Industrial School. Alongside learning to read and write, children were also taught trades like carpentry, metalwork, and tailoring to set them up for future employment. The education wasn't completely terrible. They were taught how to swim, run, jump, tumble, and skip. Sports were quite important. That might explain why Charlie became so physical in his work later on. In his movies, he was his own stuntman. He knew how to walk on a tightrope, how to roller skate, how to fall and roll. Some of those skills probably came from his time at this school, but it wasn't all physical education and useful skills. The school wasn't only concerned with the child's physical welfare, but also its moral discipline. The gym doubled up as the punishment room. Penalties included reduced food rations, regular beatings, and being locked up in a windowless cell for up to 24 hours. Every Thursday, the names of kids who had misbehaved were read out in the playground, and on Friday, they were punished. The boys would be brought into the gym and lined up. It was only the boys. The girls weren't beaten, and it was only the boys aged over 7. There'd be a desk, and they would be lined up for their punishment. Charlie once got into trouble for something he didn't even do. He was accused of setting fire to the toilet block. When asked if he was guilty or not guilty, Charlie, nervous and impelled by a force beyond his control, blurted out guilty. He later wrote, "I felt neither resentment nor injustice, but a sense of frightening adventure as they led me to the desk and administered 3 strokes across my bottom. The pain was so excruciating that it took my breath away, but I did not cry out, and although paralyzed with pain and carried to the mattress to recover, I felt violently triumphant." His granddaughter later reflected that being an actress herself, she could see the joy of having the whole room staring at you and getting the punishment, being able to control your emotions and feeling triumphant. She thought that Charlie learned a lot of discipline at the school, mostly how to become a stronger person and a more independent person. After going through this, he probably realized that he could get through anything. Charlie took that resilience and turned it into gold. In 1913, he moved to Hollywood, where he turned his experience of poverty into cinema gold with his classic comic persona, the Little Tramp. 2 years later, at age 26, he was earning the equivalent of $8 million a year, making him one of the highest paid people in the world. But Charlie never forgot his mother. In 1921, he rescued Hannah from the asylum. She spent her last 7 years in luxury in California, a world away from the workhouse. Meanwhile, back in Glasgow, Brian Cox's great-grandfather Patrick McCann suffered a serious injury that left him disabled and unemployed at the age of 40. His wife had died, making him a single parent, bringing up his son Samuel, age 6, by himself. Patrick and Samuel became familiar faces at the poorhouse gates. They were constantly going in and out. Patrick would apply, get in with bronchitis, stay for a few days, then get thrown back out as soon as he was well enough to work. For 14 years, Patrick was put through this ordeal time and time again as his health became forever worse. The authorities never gave him the level of health care he needed. In fact, they classified him as a malingerer, someone who was trying to cheat the system. Malingerers and others of questionable character was the official designation. They believed Patrick was undeserving of help, that his illness wasn't genuine. The Victorian system divided people into the deserving and undeserving poor, and they decided Patrick was undeserving. By 1911, Patrick McCann was declared insane by a doctor. He was 54 years old when he was sent to Gartnerville Asylum. By that time, he was one of 45,000 old and infirm paupers who were moved from workhouses to asylums around the country because the authorities didn't know what else to do with them. You know what's crazy? Within 4 years, they were sending these same people in front of machine guns to fight a war for them. The injustice of it is astonishing. The noon bell rings and you return to the dining hall. Your back is already aching, your hands raw from the stone breaking. The day is only half over. Barbara Taylor Bradford, one of Britain's highest-earning novelists, had no idea about her family's workhouse history until she received the manuscript of her biography. She burst into tears when she read that her grandmother Edith Walker and her mother Frida had been in the workhouse. Her mother had never spoken of it. Edith took Barbara's mother Frida to Ripon Workhouse in Yorkshire when Frida was 6 years old. Why would a mother take her child to such a place? The answer was on Frida's birth certificate. The name of the father was left blank. Frida was illegitimate. Not only that, but Edith went on to have 2 more children, all illegitimately. The second child was born at the workhouse. Edith had been shunned by her family for having children out of wedlock. There were over 7,000 illegitimate births a year in workhouses all over the country, as the institution was increasingly being used by the poor for free health care. Back in the stone yard, the afternoon stretches endlessly before you. The rhythmic sound of hammers striking stone fills the air. Your stomach still growls despite lunch. The work is mind-numbing by design. Later that afternoon, you notice a commotion at the gate. A woman with 2 small children, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. New arrivals. You watch as they're separated at the entrance. The mother to the women's ward, the children to the children's dormitory. You remember your first day, the humiliation of the admission process, how they strip you of everything, your clothes, your possessions, your dignity, your family, the supervised bath, the medical examination, being issued the uniform that marks you as a pauper. Workhouse life was ruled by bells and routine. A typical day started at 5 or 6 in the morning, depending on the season. Work began after breakfast and continued until the midday meal, resuming afterwards until the evening meal at 6. Prayers were read before breakfast and after supper. By 8 o'clock, most inmates were in bed. Women's work included doing the laundry, which was back-breaking labour involving hauling wet sheets and clothes, scrubbing them on washboards, wringing them out by hand and hanging them to dry. They also did the cooking, cleaning and sewing for the institution. Men were often assigned to break stones, crush bones for fertiliser, grind corn or chop wood. The work was deliberately tedious and exhausting. Children over 7 were put to work for several hours a day, as well as receiving some basic education. Boys might work in the gardens or farms attached to rural workhouses, while girls were trained in domestic service. In 1900, actor Brian Cox's great-grandfather Patrick McCann was finally reunited with his 3 sons in Dundee. Against all odds, they managed to be together again as a family after years of separation caused by the poorhouse system. Patrick even got to meet his 2-year-old granddaughter. The sun begins to set outside. The stone yard empties as the men shuffle back inside for the final meal of the day. Your body feels heavier with each step, the mind-numbing routine already wearing you down after just 2 days. In the dining hall, silence reigns again. The same wooden tables, the same tin plates, the same meagre portions. The faces around you show varying degrees of resignation. Some have been here for years. Some are just passing through during hard times. All bear the mark of this place, this system designed to break their spirit. After supper, there's a brief period of free time. Some read tattered Bibles in the corner, others just stare into space. Conversation is minimal and hushed. Too much fraternizing is discouraged. Then the bell for bedtime. Back to the dormitory, back to the thin mattress and single blanket. Back to the sounds and smells of too many bodies in too small a space. You lie down every muscle in your body sighing with relief. The hard work has one advantage. It makes sleep come quickly despite the discomfort. Around you, men are already beginning to snore. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. The endless routine designed to punish you for the crime of being poor. The workhouse isn't just a place, it's a sentence. Your eyes grow heavy as you stare up at the high ceiling. Your body relaxes deeper into the thin mattress, finding those small spots of comfort where you can. The soreness in your muscles slowly fades as you sink further into the bed. A yawn escapes and you shift slightly, settling in as the sounds of the workhouse at night create a strange, almost soothing rhythm around you. It's your third day in the workhouse, and you're starting to understand the rhythm of the place. The bell, the shuffle to breakfast, the back-breaking work, the meagre meals, the enforced silence, the early bed. Repeat until what? Until you can find work outside? Until you die? For many, there was no exit plan. Let's talk about what happened to the women in workhouses. Their experience was often even worse than the men's, especially if they were unmarried mothers. Felicity Kendall's great-grandmother Mary Little had little choice but to go to the workhouse when she broke the strict moral code of Victorian society. Mary had married John Little in 1880, and they'd successfully raised 9 children together during 18 years of marriage. But in 1898, at the age of 41, Mary gave birth to a 10th child, Albert, and everything changed. See, the baby wasn't her husband's. The birth certificate showed no father listed. Albert was illegitimate. Mary had become pregnant through an extramarital affair, and her husband John threw her out. Mary joined thousands of other disgraced women forced to give birth in the workhouse because of the social stigma of illegitimacy. Some workhouses even had special uniforms for these women, waspish yellow and black stripes calculated to shame them and to warn others to avoid them. Albert was one of 7,000 children born illegitimately every year in workhouses, people who would forever have to live with the stigma of starting life on the lowest rung of society. But soon after Albert was born, Mary managed to escape the workhouse and get a job as a maid at High Force Forge. She and little Albert shared the attic dormitory with 5 other staff. It was tiny, but compared to the workhouse, it must have felt like a sanctuary. But this sanctuary would be all too short. Soon after Albert's 3rd birthday, there was a knock on the door. Government officials arrived to take the 1901 census. On the census form, Mary is first listed as married, but then that's crossed out and replaced with widow. She was trying to pass herself off as a widow to explain why she was alone with a child. This little lie might have been her undoing, because we know some point after 1901 she ended up back in the workhouse again. That little M on the census form might have caused it. In 1901, Queen Victoria died and the Edwardian era began. The Victorian workhouse had become an institution with a toxic reputation. Like ex-prisoners, former workhouse inmates faced prejudice and mistrust when they came out and tried to get on with their lives. You take a break from stone breaking, stretching your aching back. The overseer glares but says nothing. He knows you're still new, still adjusting to the brutal pace. The man next to you looks like he's been here for years. His hands are calloused, his face weathered beyond his age. He doesn't look up, doesn't stop his methodical smashing of rocks. It's like he's forgotten there's any other way to live. Across the yard, you see the women's exercise area. They're walking in circles, wearing identical shapeless dresses. No talking allowed, just the endless circuit of the yard. Among them, you spot a young woman with a haunted look. Later, you learn she's unwed and pregnant. The workhouse is her only option. After Mary Little returned to the workhouse, something even worse happened. The authorities decided to take her son Albert away from her. In 1902, when Albert was 4 years old, the workhouse guardians recommended he be under the control of the guardians until he attained the age of 18 years. He was taken into the custody of the workhouse at Ulverston in Cumbria. This was a new practice that had come in. The Board of Guardians was allowed to adopt children that they felt were in danger, children whose parents had died, children whose parents were in prison, or children whose parents were of what they called low moral standing. They definitely tarnished Mary with that brush. The Victorian ideal was that if a woman has an illegitimate child or a child that's the result of adultery, the woman is responsible for the sin. In Ulverston, Albert was housed in a special children's block and segregated from the adult inmates, including his mother. 12 months after he was taken into care, Mary applied to the guardians to try to take Albert back. Her application was denied. She couldn't have a son back because she had lost all parental rights to him. Albert at this point was almost 5 years old. The authorities prevented Mary from seeing Albert again. She moved to another workhouse and disappeared from his life. Albert stayed in Ulverston workhouse until he was 16 years old. With no known family to go to, he faced the issue of what to do with the rest of his life. The stigma of the workhouse meant that Albert had limited job opportunities in the world outside. So in 1915, he followed the example of thousands of other workhouse boys and enlisted to join the army. You join the line for the midday meal. Hunger overrides dignity as you accept the ladle of thin stew. There's a bit of gristle floating in it today. You're pathetically grateful for that small bit of protein. The bread is stale but filling. You eat every crumb. At the table, you listen to the whispered conversations around you. Talking isn't allowed, but inmates find ways to exchange information. You learn that Saturday is bath day. Once a week, you'll be marched to a communal bath where you'll wash under supervision. Privacy doesn't exist here. You also learn about the vagrant ward. It's separate from the main workhouse for those just passing through. Tramps can stay for 1 or 2 nights, but must perform a work task in return for food and shelter. The conditions there are even worse than in the main building. In Scotland, a different type of childcare scheme was being tried. Rather than raising poor children inside the workhouse, they were fostered out to new families far away, offering them the chance of a new life. Brian Cox's great-grandfather Patrick McCann sought to have his son Samuel fostered out. He was initially refused, but when Samuel was 10, the authorities relented and agreed to send him to a family in Ayrshire. Samuel was one of over 6,000 children to be fostered out to families in Scotland every year. With the strong tradition of community welfare, Scottish children were able to start new lives free from the weight of poverty. The success of bringing up children in crofters' cottages led to the scheme being adopted in England at the end of the 19th century, paving the way for the modern foster home system. Meanwhile, an even more radical child welfare policy was gaining momentum to send poor children to the other side of the world. Barbara Taylor Bradford's mother's siblings, the children of her grandmother Edith, who had married John Simpson after leaving the workhouse, ended up back in Ripon Workhouse in 1924 after their mother died. The children, Norman, Francis and Edith, were discharged into the care of the NSPCC, National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and then placed in the custody of Dr. Barnardo's, a private charity established to look after orphaned and abandoned children. Using their powers, they took the Simpson children from Ripon Workhouse and sent them to the colonies. All 3 were migrated to New South Wales in Australia. Barbara's aunts and uncles were sent to the colonies as part of a wider scheme that dated back to the 1700s to resettle poor children thousands of miles away from their parents and the roots of poverty. In total, 150,000 children were sent overseas under the scheme. The last of them left Britain as recently as 1967. Since then, there has been official acknowledgement of the cruelty of this forcible migration policy. In 2010, Prime Minister Gordon Brown formally apologised to all those families who had been affected. Barbara's mother Frida died without ever seeing her sister again. Barnardo's last known record of Edith was that she was still living in Western Australia in 1937. The afternoon drags on. Your hands are blistered from the stone breaking. Your back aches, your throat is dry, water is rationed, given out at specific times. Thirst is just another discomfort to endure. You look up at the workhouse walls. They're high but not impossible to scale. People do escape sometimes, but where would you go? With no money, no references, and the stigma of the workhouse hanging over you, freedom might be worse than captivity. For now, at least you have food and shelter. That's more than many on the outside. That's the cruel calculus of poverty, choosing between evils with no good options in sight. Let's talk about Felicity Kendall's great-uncle Albert. After joining the army, he was sent to the front in 1916. Just on the eve of the second big battle at Ypres, which was absolute slaughter. Albert was very lucky. He had just come from training in the UK and didn't see action straight away, but then he did see a lot of significant action after that. It's extraordinary that he wasn't wounded. He was incredibly lucky to get through all of that. After the First World War, the government offered Albert and all other returning soldiers free passage to Australia. The post-war economy in Britain was in recession, and for a workhouse child, emigration offered the chance to build a new life free from the stigma of pauperism. 17,000 ex-soldiers took up the offer to establish themselves as colonists and pioneers. Albert left for Australia in 1922. Albert made the most of his opportunity in Australia and ended up owning his own farm. He married an Australian woman named Rachel and became a successful farmer. But the most interesting part is what Albert did on his marriage certificate. He listed John Little, Mary's husband, who had thrown her out when she became pregnant with Albert, as his father. It's mind-bending. He joined his family together on paper. He got John and his mother on the same piece of paper with himself and sort of legitimized himself. That was incredibly important. He'd come from nothing, been totally illegitimate and at the bottom of the heap, not respectable, and he ended up with respectability. Even more amazing, Albert's will shows he left money to his half-niece in England. He must have made contact with John Little's family at some point, probably after returning from the war. The war really did change things. Maybe his family decided that after the horrors of war, Albert meant something different to them now because he was a decorated war veteran who had served and survived. After all the history of secrecy, lies, infidelity and betrayal, Albert had made peace with his family. He died a successful man, both emotionally and financially. By 1914, the workhouse authorities had succeeded in creating a generation of fit and healthy young men out of pauper children. Stigmatized and unwanted, the obvious place for boys brought up in one institution was another one, the army. The moment had arrived for them to come forward in their country's hour of need as they volunteered in their thousands to fight in the First World War. The dinner bell rings, another silent meal, another few hours of enforced idleness before bedtime. The daily routine never varies. Some say the monotony is worse than the hunger or the hard work. Your mind starts to empty, to focus only on the immediate, the next meal, the next bell, the next instruction. Over time, the workhouse began to evolve. Instead of the most able-bodied carrying out labor, it became a refuge for the elderly and sick. As the 19th century drew to a close, people's attitudes were changing. More and more people were objecting to its cruelty, and by 1929, new legislation was introduced which allowed local authorities to take over workhouses as hospitals. The following year, workhouses were officially closed, although the volume of people caught up in the system and with no other place to go meant that it would be several years later before they truly disappeared. In fact, the workhouse survived well into the modern era until after the Second World War. It wasn't until the introduction of the NHS in 1948 that the last workhouse shut up shop as its remaining functions were absorbed into the welfare state. You lie on your thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling. Your body sinks deeper into the hard bed, somehow more comfortable tonight than it was yesterday. Muscles that screamed in protest this morning now just softly complain. You're adapting. The human body is remarkable that way. Around you, the sounds of the dormitory create a strange lullaby. The breathing of dozens of men, the occasional cough, the rustle of thin blankets. Your eyes grow heavy, but your mind still races with all you've seen and learned. What will tomorrow bring? More of the same, most likely. You shift slightly, finding a more comfortable position. The straw mattress crinkles beneath you. Your breathing naturally slows as you listen to the rain against the windows. The workhouse settles into its nightly quiet, the only sound the occasional soft snore from your fellow inmates sharing this hard fate with you. You've been in the workhouse for over a week now. The initial shock has faded into a dull acceptance. Your body has adjusted to the hard labour, the meagre food, the uncomfortable bed, but your mind still rebels against the crushing monotony and the loss of freedom. Breakfast is the same as always. Gruel with its bland, slightly salty taste. A small piece of bread. You eat mechanically, knowing you'll need the energy for the day ahead. Morning prayers are led by the chaplain, a stern-faced man who seems to believe poverty is a moral failing rather than a circumstance. Religion played an important part in workhouse life, with prayers read to the paupers before breakfast and after supper each day. Let's dive deeper into what happened to friend Carter's son, Jesse. After he died in the London hospital, a message would have been sent down to Kent to inform the family. For them, this created a huge dilemma, not just about the body, but also about Jesse's afterlife. That was the belief at the time. What they feared most was what would happen in the dissection rooms. Dissection didn't just mean slightly cutting the body, it meant cutting it a lot. It was a brutal process. This was all legal thanks to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which basically said that for the crime of poverty you would be dissected. The workhouse system would care for you in life, provided that you repaid your welfare debt to society in death. Most people think of the Victorians as philanthropic, religious, God-fearing, charitable, and kind. And yet, if you were living on the poverty line, you were considered scum. You were a criminal because you never made it up to the next rung of the ladder, and because of that you were penalised so much that you gave your body when you died. By the beginning of the 20th century, Britain was accelerating into the modern age. Cars were appearing on the roads, the telephone was becoming widely used, and the first X-ray machines were being installed in London's private hospitals. The workhouse, too, was modernising. The standard of food, education, and healthcare inside was now better than the conditions a pauper could expect outside. But despite the material improvements, workhouse inmates remained tainted by the stigma of failure. You're assigned to a new task today, working in the vegetable garden. It's a relief from the stone yard. The soil is damp from recent rain, and there's something satisfying about planting seeds, even if they're not for your own benefit. The overseer is less harsh here, allowing occasional conversation as long as the work continues steadily. An older inmate works alongside you, showing you how to space the seedlings properly. His name is Thomas, and he's been here for 3 years. His wife died, his children moved away, and at 65, no one would hire him. The workhouse was his only option. At least I'll get a proper burial, he tells you quietly. Been saving, got a little fund for it, won't end up on the cutting table. His words remind you of the fate that awaits many who die here. Not just death, but a final indignity. It seems even in death, the poor cannot escape judgment. Let's talk about what happened with Barbara Taylor Bradford's grandmother, Edith Walker. Edith had taken Barbara's mother Frida to Ripon Workhouse when Frida was 6 years old. Then Edith had 2 more illegitimate children in the workhouse. But on October 15, 1910, Edith and her illegitimate children left the workhouse. That very day, they all walked around the corner to Ripon Cathedral, where Edith married John Simpson. This seemed like a happy ending, but it wasn't quite. By 1924, Edith had died, and her children with John Simpson, Norman, Francis and Edith, were admitted to Ripon Workhouse. They had been twice neglected by their father, John Simpson. When an NSPCC inspector visited the family, they found the children to be in a dirty and verminous condition. John Simpson was serving a 3-month prison sentence for their further neglect. Frida, Barbara's mother, was by then grown up, married, and working as a nurse in Leeds. After learning that her siblings had been sent to Australia, she wrote to Dr. Barnardo's asking about her youngest sister, little Edith. Frida wrote, "I write to you to ask you if you can give me any information concerning my youngest sister by name Edith Simpson. She was taken into one of your homes when she was a small child between 5 and 7 years. Barnardo's replied that Edith had gone out to Australia with one of their parties in April 1928 and is extremely happy and is getting on nicely out there. Frida responded, "It has taken a great load off my mind to know little Edith is still alive and doing so well, but now I am happily married and have a nice cottage of my own in a nice part of the city. I have been hoping that I might be allowed to bring Edith to live with me, as I could take good care of her now." She continued, "Please don't think me selfish wishing to have her now when you have cared for her and educated her and brought her up to be such a good girl, but it is just a longing for my own people." Barnardo's replied that they couldn't bear the expense of bringing Edith back to England, which would be from £32 to £36. Frida and her husband didn't have that kind of money to spare. Frida died without ever seeing her sister again. Barnardo's last known record of Edith was that she was still living in Western Australia in 1937. The midday bell rings. You wash your hands in the cold water pump, the dirt from the garden embedding itself under your fingernails. The dining hall is as silent as ever. The food is marginally better today. A thin stew with more vegetables than usual. Perhaps some came from the garden where you were working. You notice a man at the end of the table. His hands shake slightly as he eats. His eyes dart nervously around the room. A new arrival still adjusting to the shock of the place. You remember how that felt just days ago, how quickly we adapt to new normals, no matter how terrible. After lunch, it's back to the garden. The physical work is exhausting, but preferable to the mind-numbing tedium of picking oakum or breaking stones. At least here, you can see the results of your labour. The neat rows of seedlings promise future harvests. There's something hopeful in that, even if you won't be here to see them grow. Let's talk about what happened to Charlie Chaplin's mother, Hannah. She was committed to an asylum after she was separated from Charlie in Lambeth Workhouse. Charlie was sent to live in a school for poor children miles away from the life he'd known. But Charlie's resilience is what stands out in his story. In 1913, he moved to Hollywood, where he turned his experience of poverty into cinema gold with his classic comic persona, the Little Tramp. 2 years later, age 26, he was earning the equivalent of $8 million a year, making him one of the highest paid people in the world. He went on to co-found United Artists, still one of the most famous studios in Hollywood today, but Charlie never forgot his mother and rescued Hannah from the asylum in 1921. She spent her last 7 years in luxury in California, a world away from the workhouse. Charlie's success may be unique, but the resistance he showed against all the odds is shared by other workhouse inmates. People who took on the system and left a legacy of courage and defiance for future generations. The afternoon wears on. The sun breaks through the clouds occasionally, warming your back as you work. It's almost pleasant if you can forget where you are, but the high walls surrounding the workhouse grounds are always visible, a constant reminder of your confinement. By the early 20th century, workhouses were changing. They were increasingly being used by the poor for free healthcare rather than as a deterrent to idleness. Astonishingly, the workhouse survived well into the modern era until after the Second World War. In 100 years, it was home to over 16 million people caught between poverty and destitution. By the time it finally shut down in 1948, 5 million people had died in the workhouse. The Victorian era became associated with imperial pomp and industrial revolution, but the workhouse represented the vast underbelly of society, an institution that caused misery to millions and evoked shame in even more. Today, 1 in every 10 Britons has a family connection to this formidable institution. Amongst the stories of tragedy, there are also stories of triumph against overwhelming odds. Let's go back to Felicity Kendall's great-uncle Albert. He left behind his workhouse origins and made a success of himself in Australia, but there's a sad part to his story that we haven't covered yet. When Albert was taken into the custody of the workhouse at age 4, his mother Mary also had another child, Claude, who was just 18 months old. Claude died of diarrhea, a common cause of infant death amongst the poor. Claude would have been Felicity's great-uncle too. He was buried in Ulverston Cemetery. When Felicity visited his grave, she laid stones on it. Being Jewish, she didn't leave flowers. She reflected, "I think the thing about Mary, one of the things that I'm taking away from her story, is that it was tragic, and this obviously is the ultimate tragedy. But having buried little Claude, she may have been grateful that at least Albert was safe, that he would be looked after." The other way Mary might have reacted as a mother would be, "Oh my goodness, what if he's ill and I can't be there to hold his hand and mop his brow?" The authorities prevented Mary from seeing Albert again. She moved to another workhouse and disappeared from his life. Albert stayed in Ulverston Workhouse until he was 16 years old. The dinner bell rings. You join the line with the other men, filing into the dining hall. Your clothes are damp with sweat from the day's labour. The evening meal is the usual bread and cheese. Occasionally there might be a bit of butter, but not today. After dinner, there's a brief period of free time before prayers and bed. Some men read Bibles or newspapers if they're lucky enough to get hold of one. Others just sit, staring into space. The endless routine has worn away at their capacity for joy or interest. You've started to notice the different types of inmates. There are the regulars, often elderly or disabled people who have nowhere else to go. There are the in-and-outers who come during hard times and leave when work can be found. And there are the truly desperate, those who have lost everything and everyone. You're one of the in and outers, you hope. This is temporary. Once spring comes, there will be more work available. You just need to endure until then. But you've seen how easily people can become institutionalized, how the spirit can be broken by the relentless grind of workhouse life. The early Victorian pioneers of the workhouse viewed poverty as a crime, but as the 20th century unfolded, there was a growing sense that it was a social problem which could only be treated by showing greater compassion. In this new world order, the idea of a deterrent workhouse looked increasingly outdated. Over time, many of its functions had been discharged to specialized institutions like pauper schools and free hospitals for the poor as a new model of social welfare began to take shape. In 1929, the workhouse was formally abolished by an Act of Parliament, although it took almost 20 years to phase out altogether. With the introduction of the NHS in 1948, the last workhouse shut up shop as its remaining functions were absorbed into the welfare state. Today, almost all physical traces of the institution have been covered up or erased, but its shadow nonetheless falls over millions of people whose lives have been touched by their families' secrets from the workhouse. The bedtime bell rings. Another day done, another day survived. You return to the dormitory, to the same thin mattress, the same scratchy blanket. Your body aches from the day's work, but it's a productive ache. Unlike the stone breaking, the garden work felt purposeful, meaningful somehow. You lie down, feeling your muscles relax as they sink into the hard bed. Around you, the sounds of men settling for the night, coughs, sighs, the occasional muttered word. Outside, the wind has picked up, rattling the windows slightly. Your mind drifts to thoughts of home, of freedom. Will you ever leave this place, or will you become like Thomas, resigned to ending your days here? The uncertainty hangs over you like a cloud. You shift position, seeking that elusive, comfortable spot. Your breathing slows naturally as the workhouse settles around you. Your limbs grow heavy with fatigue. The rhythm of the institution, the bells, the meals, the work, has already become familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Your eyes grow heavy as you watch the shadows on the ceiling cast by the single gas lamp in the corridor outside, dancing gently as someone walks past. Days blur into one another in the workhouse. It's been 2 weeks now. The strict routine has become your life. The morning bell, the gruel, the work, the enforced silence, the early nights. You found small ways to preserve your dignity, keeping your uniform as clean as possible. Standing straight despite your exhaustion, meeting the master's eyes when he barks orders. Today is Sunday, which means church attendance is mandatory. At least it's a break from physical labour. You sit on the hard wooden bench surrounded by your fellow inmates, all in identical uniforms. The sermon is predictable. The virtues of hard work, the sins of idleness, the Christian duty to accept one's lot in life. You look around at the faces of those who've been here longer than you. Some look resigned, some bitter, some empty of all emotion. Is that your future too, or will you find a way out before the place claims your spirit? Let's talk about what happened to the workhouse system as time went on. By the early 20th century, things were changing. The British people had begun to question whether poverty was really a moral failing or if it might actually be a societal problem. The brutal treatment of the poor was increasingly seen as inhumane. Improvements were being made. New buildings like separate infirmaries were constructed. Trained nurses were employed. The diet improved slightly. Children received better education, but the stigma remained. Even as the physical conditions improved, being a workhouse inmate still meant you were seen as the lowest of the low. People would cross the street to avoid walking past a workhouse, as if poverty might be contagious. A woman named Alma Scaife came to Ripon Workhouse in 1942. She was just 6 years old, the same age as Barbara Taylor Bradford's mother when she was there. Even in the 1940s, conditions were still harsh. Alma remembered the fear most of all, the bad memories, having to wear cardboard in her shoes to go to school because the workhouse wouldn't provide proper footwear. When she grew up, Alma was determined that her own children would never experience the shame and deprivation she had known. She said, "My children didn't have a hand-me-down like I had. Everything I wore was given. My children, if I had anything given, it went in the bin. So you did give them a better life?" "Oh yeah, always Clark shoes, always Ladybird clothes. They've had everything, my children." Barbara Taylor Bradford's mother said something similar. "I want you to have the kind of life I should have had." Barbara often wondered what her mother meant, and now she thinks it was about being in Ripon Workhouse. That experience gave her mother that determination and toughness and will to make sure Barbara had a different life, to give her the opportunities her mother didn't have. After lunch, there's a rare treat, an hour of free time in the yard. The weather is mild for February, almost spring-like. You sit on a bench feeling the weak sun on your face. It's the small pleasures that keep you going, the taste of slightly sweetened tea that's sometimes served on Sundays. The brief moment of warmth in the washroom before the cold water hits. The occasional kind word from a fellow inmate. "You've been assigned to the laundry tomorrow. It's hard work, hauling wet sheets, operating the mangle, breathing in the steam and harsh soap fumes, but at least it's indoors, away from the biting wind that makes the stone yard so miserable in winter." By 1914, with war looming in Europe, the workhouse system had actually succeeded in creating a generation of fit and healthy young men out of pauper children, stigmatized and unwanted. The obvious place for boys brought up in one institution was another one, the army. When World War I broke out, workhouse boys volunteered in their thousands. It was their chance to escape, to prove their worth, to perhaps find a new life after the fighting was done. Many never returned. Those who did came back changed, sometimes physically with missing limbs or lungs damaged by gas, sometimes mentally with what was then called shell shock. The war changed British society in profound ways. Class divisions began to blur slightly. The shared experience of suffering created a sense of national unity, and people began to question whether those who had fought for their country should really be condemned to the workhouse if they fell on hard times. Brian Cox reflected on his great-grandfather Patrick McCann's story. What they went through, it just leaves you. It's really bad. My great-grandfather is emblematic of an epidemic of poverty, and he's trying to give validity to his life. You see that he's trying to deal with his son. He's trying to deal with his own dignity. Patrick was just one man caught in a brutal system, but his story, and millions like it, eventually led to change. The injustice couldn't be ignored forever. The dinner bell rings. As you join the line for the evening meal, you notice a new arrival, an elderly woman probably in her 70s being escorted to the women's ward. Her back is bent, her steps tiny and hesitant. Another life reduced to this, another person for whom the workhouse is the last stop. The 1920s saw more changes. The poor law unions were abolished and responsibility for workhouses was transferred to local authorities. Many were converted into hospitals or care homes. The language changed too, no longer inmates but residents or patients. A small dignity, but significant. Then came the Great Depression. Unemployment soared. More people than ever needed help. The old system simply couldn't cope. It became increasingly clear that a new approach was needed. The Second World War accelerated the changes. The British people had endured bombing, rationing, and loss together. The idea that the poor, the sick, and the elderly should be left to the mercy of the workhouse system seemed increasingly outdated and cruel. In 1948, with the introduction of the National Health Service, the last workhouses finally closed. The buildings were repurposed as hospitals, homes for the elderly, or simply demolished. A dark chapter in British social history was officially over, but the legacy of the workhouse lived on in the memories of those who had experienced it, in the family stories passed down through generations, and in the cultural attitudes toward poverty that persist even today. As you prepare for bed, you wonder what will become of you. Will you find work when spring comes? Will you escape this place before it becomes your permanent home? Or will you join the ranks of those who have nowhere else to go, for whom the workhouse is both prison and sanctuary? You lie down on your thin mattress, pulling the single blanket up to your chin. The dormitory is quiet except for the usual coughs and snores. Tomorrow will be the same as today, and the day after that. The relentless routine grinds down hope, wears away identity, until all that's left is survival. Yet even here, human dignity persists, in small acts of kindness between inmates, in the determination to maintain some sense of self despite the institutional uniforms and rules, in the dreams of escape and better days that visit during the long nights. The story of the workhouse is not just a story of cruelty and despair, it's also a story of resilience, of people like Charlie Chaplin, who rose from workhouse child to global superstar, of people like Albert Little, who built a new life on the other side of the world, of people like Frida Walker, who ensured her daughter would never know the shame and hardship she had experienced. It's a story of a society slowly learning that poverty is not a moral failing, but a social problem that requires compassion rather than punishment. That progress was painfully slow, bought with the suffering of millions, but it did come eventually. The Victorian workhouse stands as a reminder of how far we've come, and perhaps as a warning of how easily we could return to seeing the poor as deserving of their fate if we're not vigilant. You shift in your bed, finding a slightly more comfortable position. Your body is tired from the day's labour, your mind drifting towards sleep. The workhouse breathes around you, a living entity of stone and rules and human struggle. Your breathing deepens as your body relaxes further into the mattress. The day's tensions begin to melt away. Even in this harsh place, sleep offers temporary escape, a few hours of freedom in dreams. Your eyelids grow heavy as you stare up at the ceiling. The gaslight in the corridor casts shifting shadows that dance across the plaster. The rhythm of your breathing slows, becomes deeper, more regular. Outside, the wind has died down. The workhouse is quiet now. Just the occasional creak of the old building settling, the distant sound of the night watchman's footsteps on his rounds. Your limbs feel heavy, pleasantly weighted against the mattress. Each breath carries you deeper into relaxation. Your thoughts become less focused, more dreamlike. Images of the day drift through your mind. The garden soil between your fingers, the steam rising from the bowl of gruel, the sunlight in the yard. The edge between wakefulness and sleep blurs. Your consciousness begins to float, untethered from the physical discomforts of the workhouse. For these few hours, you're free. Your breathing is slow and deep now, your body completely at rest. The sounds around you fade as sleep approaches. The workhouse holds many stories of suffering and survival, of cruelty and occasional kindness, of lives constrained by poverty and society's judgment. But tomorrow is another day. Perhaps it will bring a letter with news of work. Perhaps spring will come early, bringing jobs and the chance to leave. Perhaps you'll find small moments of connection with your fellow inmates that make the days more bearable. For now, though, There is just the comfort of rest. Your eyes close fully, your mind drifting into the welcome embrace of sleep. The tension leaves your face, your hands unclench, your shoulders drop. Sleep comes gently, wrapping around you like a warmer blanket than the workhouse provides. Your breathing settles into the rhythm of deep slumber. For a few precious hours, you're no longer a workhouse inmate, but simply a human being at rest. The stories of the workhouse will continue to be told, passed down through generations, a reminder of both human cruelty and human resilience. But for now, in this moment, there is just the peace of sleep, the temporary escape from hardship, the brief respite before another workhouse day begins. Your mind drifts deeper, consciousness fading like the last light of day. Dreams begin to form at the edges of your awareness, taking you far from the workhouse walls, far from the rigid rules and meagre food, far from the identity of pauper that's been forced upon you. In sleep, you're free. Your breathing is deep and regular, your body completely relaxed. All the tension of workhouse life melts away as you sink deeper and deeper into restful slumber. The world fades, worries fade. There is only the gentle rhythm of your breathing and the welcome embrace of sleep. And as you drift off completely, there's a sense that this too shall pass, that the workhouse, for all its power to dominate your days, cannot claim your dreams, that somewhere beyond these walls another life waits. But for now, there is just sleep, deep, restful sleep. Your body surrenders to it completely as the night wraps around you like a protective cloak. Sleep now. Rest deeply, let go of the workhouse and all its hardships, for in sleep, at least, you are truly free. Your breathing slows, your mind quiets, and you drift away into the peaceful darkness of slumber, leaving the workhouse far behind until morning light returns.